waiting for the mic. Okay, so. Thank you. Dr. Jennifer Holberg comes to us from Calvin College, where she's professor of English literature. An accomplished scholar, Professor Holberg serves as the head of the Faculty Senate, was voted Professor of the Year, and is co-founder of Pedagogy, a journal published by Duke University. Please welcome my sister, Jennifer Holberg.
Well, I can't tell you what a delight it is. I know John has told you I'm short, so now I've confirmed that. What a delight it is to feel the love you have for my brother. Thank you so much for being the wonderful community that you are. John always, it's a delight to be here at Covenant today. John always tells me it's the most wonderful place on earth, and you've just demonstrated that. You all have really made me feel welcome in general. I want to thank Leah and Grant for all their hospitality, for the women last night who came out to have a really wonderful and thought-provoking conversation. So thanks, Covenant. It's really good to be here. And I know I'm not going to compete with my brother, which is good. In fact, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But before we begin, I want us to commit our time to God. So would you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So, next month is my favorite of all holidays. Some of you are Christmas people, already ready to get out those decorations, but I am a Thanksgiving person. I love the food. I mean, who doesn't like a mashed potato? Double Chin says yes. The pie, the football, time off to catch up on my grading, all of that sort of thing. But mostly I love Thanksgiving because I'm absolutely convinced that gratitude must lie at the center of our lives as the animating force of our words and our actions. But saying thank you actually requires being attentive, paying attention to what you've been given, who's given it to you, all of those sort of things. But attentiveness, paying attention, is really not something our culture values. In fact, T.S. Eliot, I really resonate with what he says. He says, we are distracted from distraction by distraction. Distracted by distraction from distraction, right? Anyone texting right now? Anyone tweeting me live? Yes? All right. Now, my boy John Calvin, now you may know as Calvin professors, we are contractually obligated to always quote Calvin in any speech. But my boy John Calvin puts it this way: and since the glory of God's power and wisdom shine most brightly above, heaven is often called his palace. Yet, wherever you cast your eyes, there is no spot in the universe wherein you cannot discern at least some sparks of his glory. You cannot in one glance survey this most vast and beautiful system of the universe in its wide expanse without being completely overwhelmed by the boundless force of its brightness. But here's what's interesting. Calvin concludes this passage by saying, certainly, however much the glory of God shines forth, scarcely one person in 100 is a true spectator of it. Let me read that to you again. Certainly, however much the glory of God shines forth, scarcely one person in 100 is a true spectator of it. In other words, sparks of glory are everywhere. This morning, what a beautiful morning, sparks of glory, but we're too busy to see them. The vision that Calvin gives us here is a world of God's transforming splendor. An amazing world where, as my minister likes to end every service, a resurrection has happened. How would that change our view of the world? But a world, importantly, of plenitude, like Jesus promises us in John 10:10. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. So paying attention and the abundant life seem related. So if that's true, if paying attention is central to an abundant life, how do we do it? Now, as John said in his beautifully brief introduction, I'm an English professor, so of course I'm going to suggest to you this morning that the answer to that question lies in part in story. What kind of stories do we tell about our lives? What kind of stories do we value? In his book, Whistling in the Dark, Frederick Buechner argues that we grow more attentive in and through story. This is what he says. It is well to remember that it is well to remember what the ancient creeds of the Christian faith declare credence in. For better or for worse, it is a story. It is absolutely crucial, therefore, to keep in constant touch with what is going on in your own life story and to pay attention to what's going on in the stories of other people's lives. If God is present anywhere, it is in those stories that God is present. And if God is not present in those stories, then they are scarcely worth telling. Stories then have tremendous power, and I must admit to you all at the start that it is an interesting and perhaps even somewhat discombobulating feeling coming to a place where there's already narrative assumptions in place about me and who I am as the sister of John Holberg. Now, I'm the older sister, although not that much older. Someone yesterday asked me if I was his mother. No, I am not his mother. I am 2 years older, although I did get our mother's hair and he did not. So I'm going gray, and he has a picture in a closet somewhere that looks awful, but he himself looks good. But I'm the older sister, and I suppose it's actually sort of fitting, I was thinking about this, to come to a place where my primary identity is as the sister of John, because that was his whole growing up, right? He came behind me in school and was always Jennifer Holberg's little brother. And so it's interesting to think about the ways in which stories constrain what we think about people, or possibly what we help us imagine them. So I'm sure some of you right now are sitting there thinking, she is not what I thought she was going to be, and some of you are thinking, she's exactly what I thought she was going to be. In any case, stories are powerful because they help us imagine our lives and other people's lives too. From the time we're little, we use stories to imagine the possibilities that life was going to offer us. Think about the stories you've told yourself over the years about what you were going to be when you grow up, what you want to do, what your wedding will look like, how many children you might have, etc., etc. Right now, I'd wager that you could each tell me a story about what you think this next year is going to be like for you here. But stories don't just help us think expansively, the sort of what if, they also normalize narratives. In other words, the more we hear a story or don't hear a story, the more normal it becomes. Back in the 90s, Wired magazine, do you know Wired magazine? It's a technology magazine, had an article called Overcoming Yuck. And the idea of it is that as there was every technological advance, most people resisted it because it was yucky. So example, contacts. Who would stick their finger in their eye? Like, that seems weird, little pieces of plastic. But the argument went, the more people heard this story, the less yucky it becomes. And now we're all like sticking our fingers in our eyes, okay? So narrative, in other words, normalizes. If we hear a story enough, or we don't hear a story, that becomes the norm. And it's not just the stories we tell, it's the ones we listen to. It's the way that we interpret them. Through stories, we come to understand the expectations and norms of others around us, our families, our church, our community, the larger culture, whatever that is. Indeed, stories define those expectations and norms and implicitly signal to us whether we're successful or not. Thus, stories both encourage and constrain us, depending on our ability, individually and collectively, to critically interpret and respond to these narratives. This is why it's important that all of you take as many English classes as possible, because thank you, brother. Because that is, in fact, what we're trying to teach you how to do. But one of the problems I think we face is that we often have a sort of limited set of narratives that we allow ourselves. Do you ever feel trapped by your story? In the story that your family tells about you, or your friends, or your professors, that you're the smart one, the doofus, the responsible one, the screw-up, the youngest, right? Think about these stories that you live into. Did you hope when you came to Covenant that you would get to maybe change that story, that you would go from being that guy to that guy, right? Or what about the other classic Christian tale? I saw this in your student paper. This one's big at Calvin. Virtue is rewarded. In other words, if I am a good girl, Mr. Darcy is coming. Yes, he is. He is on his way to rescue me, and I'm going to have that ring by spring, if not winter. Now, of course, the problem with virtue is rewarded is that when you're 25 or 35 or 45, what happens when Mr. Darcy hasn't come? Is it because I haven't been virtuous? Well, I think I have been. Or that I'm not being rewarded? All of a sudden, all sorts of theological problems starts arising. Somehow God owes me something that I'm not getting, and okay? In church, I think we sometimes get a similar message about people's stories as well, that some people's stories are more important, or if not more important, at least more interesting. So the first time I was asked to tell my story in church, I was a little bit, I just didn't seem to have one. I remember even saying to my mother, maybe I should go out and spice it up a little bit. Because my basic story was, I grew up in the church. My parents, we were there when the doors were open and even when they weren't open. I did well in school, blah, 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 right? In other words, I'm a boring good girl. Woohoo! That's my story. And I sort of began to realize that I was suffering from boring testimony syndrome. Did anyone have that? I mean, my story was fine and all, but who would want to hear about that when there were other better stories? And I would argue that the church basically has two main narratives that sort of get promoted. I don't think from malice, I don't think from wrong motivation, but I think there are two. The first one is the super Christian. For me, growing up, that was Elizabeth Elliot, right? Through Gates of Splendor, I saw the movie when I was 6. I was like, wow, that's amazing. She went back and she worked with the tribe and yay, incredible story. But I think the problem is that's not necessarily, it set an expectation for what a successful Christian life looked like, for sort of in the universal. I think on the other side is what's the even more popular miserable sinner model, which is the one, where the guest speaker gets invited to church to tell about their life of crime and drugs and all manner of depravity, total and otherwise, until, of course, they're converted. And then after that, of course, the flip side is that they work with puppies or orphans in some undesirable place, and hooray. Okay. So, super Christian, miserable sinner. Now, I want to have a caveat here and say that I think both of these stories are really important. They are incredibly valid in terms of talking about God's work in the world, but I wonder about the majority of Christians whose lives will never conform to that pattern. My students tell me they struggle with this, that they think because they haven't done something exciting or have some big sin to confess or some major trauma or even some dramatic work of God in their life, that their story somehow just doesn't count as much. And I think the reliance on those two dominant narratives then leads us to develop a skewed sense of virtue and a skewed sense of sin. We subtly come to believe, even if we would never admit it, that there are people, the super Christians, for whom faith is easy. Mother Teresa, that must have been just awesome. What a woman of God. Even though we know that's not true from actually reading her later stuff. And that there are other people, the miserable sinners, who are real sinners, that God has done real work in their lives. But I think when we buy into that, we also begin to believe erroneously that our stories have to have a dramatic plot line. Because otherwise, we fear there is no proof that God is working dramatically, or maybe perhaps at all, in our lives. Ironically, by overvaluing these stories, I think we reduce God's power to accomplishing only the big stuff. Instead, I think we urgently need to hear stories of people who are living a faithful life every single day. Because I think the challenge of being kind and patient and forbearing and loving and generous and everything else we're called to do, loving God with heart, soul, strength, mind, neighbor as self, is very, very difficult. That's a super interesting story, and only accomplished through the minute working of God's grace. But by living into that narrative paradigm of the little story and giving up these sort of more dominant paradigms, It may mean that we have to rethink the story we think we're living in, or perhaps thought we needed to live into. If nothing else, it should help us revise our narrative expectation and help us to begin to value the story that God, as the author and finisher of our faith, is accomplishing in us every single day, even if it looks super boring from the outside. Now, I want to spend the rest of our time together then thinking about a couple of stories that maybe will help us with that. So story number one is about Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. She had a piano. She was under house arrest for many years in Myanmar, her native country, heavily guarded, deeply isolated, separated from her husband and her children. And so she found solace by playing this very dilapidated instrument. A small thing, no doubt, playing the piano, especially in the sort of epic life that she's led there. But the piano was the one thing that the generals of that country wouldn't take away from her. But here's what really struck me about this story when I read about it. It's not just that she played, it's not just that it maybe gave her a significant psychological edge, but it's that she was able to play at all. And she was able to play because of three men: Sao Simon, Ko Paul, and Saw Shepherd, piano tuners. The LA Times reported that these three men, over the course of her many, many years of confinement, worked often under surveillance themselves to maintain her instrument, ravaged by the heat and humidity of that climate. It wasn't easy. The instrument was old, and the spare parts were hard to find, and they were often being followed by the police, but they managed to keep her instrument playable. Small acts of resistance. And I would argue that when the history of democracy is written for Myanmar, for Burma, that these men deserve a place in that story. Small stories matter because they tell us of the vital acts that make so much of every day possible. My favorite novelist is George Eliot, and in her novel, Middlemarch, she calls these acts seeds of joy. And Eliot says we fail when we don't see the influence of every possible act of kindness, when we don't cultivate those seeds of joy that are within our power to plant. How are our lives our small seeds of joy in someone else's life? How does knowing those small things that happen every day, how are they feeding the garden that you live in? Okay, story number two. You'll remember the story perhaps of Matthias from Acts number 1. Acts chapter 1, number 1, I don't know what I'm saying. After Jesus' ascension, right, the disciples come back and they need to get a replacement for Judas. And Peter sets out their criteria, and I'll just remind you of it. So Peter says in Acts, "Therefore it is necessary to choose one of the men who have been with us the whole time Jesus was living among us, beginning from John's baptism to the time when Jesus was taken from us. For one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection." So the guy that emerges, Matthias, seems to come out of nowhere and disappear almost as quickly back into the text. Now, he'd been around Jesus' ministry from the time of John the Baptist till now. So he's been around the whole time. And yet this is the first and last we hear of him. He's the 13th disciple. Like, he should be a big deal. But you notice no mentions in the gospel, no stories in Acts, no shout-outs from Paul like, "Hey, my friend Matthias," back there, right? None of that. Doesn't that strike you as a little weird? Who is he? I mean, tradition, even though it says a little bit more about him, doesn't even agree on who he is. Interestingly, there are disagreements even about what his name might be. His story is all over the place. Ancient sources tell us of him serving in Judea, or maybe he was in the Upper Nile, sometimes among cannibals, the Eastern European country of Georgia, Ethiopia. Who knows? There's a million stories. People can't even decide how he died. There's like 4 different stories of how he died. He basically is a sort of everyman disciple. He could have been anybody. He could have ministered anywhere. And it's also kind of interesting. You got to love a guy who his saint day is considered the luckiest one, since he was the 13th, particularly when you find out he is the patron saint of the most random collection of things ever. Let me just say to you, alcoholics and those who live in Gary, Indiana. I don't know if those are related, having been to Gary. Also Great Falls, Montana, because, why not? Tailors and carpenters and smallpox. Patron saint of smallpox. Okay, bizarre. But here's what I think is important about Matthias. Perhaps the rest of his story, whatever the details are, don't really matter anyway. Because we know the one thing about his story that matters. He was a witness ready to serve. The rest of it doesn't really matter. And I think as we think about our own stories, may the same be said of us. We are a witness ready to serve. Last story is actually about me. So when I was in college, I had a scholarship called the President's Associate Scholarship. So as the President's Associates, we went and had dinner with him 4 times a year. And various donors and other people were there. And at the very first one, when I was a freshman, this little old man came up to me and chatted with me, asked me what I was majoring in and all that sort of thing. And because I was raised right, I said to him, "Oh, and what do you do?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just a retired science professor." And I was like, "Oh, great, well, nice to meet you." And from every dinner after that, all the 4 years, I always sat with him at dinner, and he was a big punster, and he would always come and tell me his newest pun, and great. Except I'm not telling you the whole story. So after the first time I met him, the president of our university came over and said to me, "Oh, I noticed you met Clyde Tombaugh." And I said, "Yeah, he seems like a really nice man." I don't think I said old man, even though I may have thought that as an 18-year-old. But he was a really nice man. And the president said to me, "You know he discovered the planet Pluto, right?" "No," I said. "He told me he was a retired science professor." So for me, you may know that Pluto just got demoted, or a couple of years ago, right? It's now a dwarf planet, although John and I are still very strongly pro-Pluto, so yay Clyde. But it's now only a dwarf planet. And poor Professor Tombaugh, such a lovely man, is now a trivia question. He's that guy who discovered a planet, really wasn't a planet. The guy who lost his planet. And so for me, I think Professor Tombaugh gives us both the positive side of story and the negative. The positive side is he was so much more than someone who discovered a planet. He was kind to an English major girl who he didn't have to be. He discovered a planet. But I also want to leave you with this question this morning, right? If you're a big deal like that, you don't really need to talk to freshman girls about puns, no. But I think that Professor Tombaugh's story is an important corrective to how we think about our own stories. Because I want to ask you to think about what happens when you lose your planet. Do you know those lovely words from Tennyson? So I'm a Victorianist, so I have to also quote Victorian poetry. He says in In Memoriam, "Our little systems have their day, they have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they." Our little systems, our bodies, our philosophies, our theologies, our technologies, breaking down. They only shed so much light, right? And thou, O Lord, art more than they. So as that happens, what happens when your achievements are surpassed? What happens when you're not the valedictorian anymore? What happens when you're not whatever it is that's important to you? What happens when you don't marry that person you thought you would? Or you do and it's hard? What about when you get that job and it's not quite what you expected? Or it is, but then what? Right? What happens when you lose your planet? What kind of person are you? Have you cultivated the right kind of story that someone can say about you even years after your death? He was a lovely person despite losing his planet. He was so much more than just that. Brothers and sisters, I want to leave you with the idea that abundant life means abundant stories. Stories about God at work everywhere and in every one of you. You are God's beloved, and that is the essence of the story. Flannery O'Connor says that the central Christian mystery is that for all its horror, humanity was found by God to be worth dying for. For all its horror, humanity was found by God to be worth dying for. That is our story. The greatest abundance comes then when we witness that in every way we can to that incredible heart of the gospel, God's lavish enactment of love. Thus, as you leave here today, in your words and your deeds, in the stories you tell and in the stories you will embody, let us together proclaim boldly and with great joy the good news of God's redemptive love, shown to us abundantly in every single one of our stories, moment by moment. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen.